Welcome to the Road to Jesus. This is Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. And today we're looking at Ezra chapter 1 through Nehemiah chapter 9. And there are a few more chapters in Nehemiah after this, but pretty much we're covering both books this week. So we just finished reading 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which tell what happened chronologically before the events of Ezra and Nehemiah. And the connection, though, between the four books is pretty close, and Ezra might have written all of them. Nehemiah also might have written Nehemiah, but some ascribe parts of it to Ezra as well. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah were written after Chronicles, or at least that's what most scholars say, but not long after. In other words, they came out about the same time, most think, and that would have been somewhere in the late 5th century BC. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah also have a close connection with the book of Esther, which comes right after this. King Ahasuerus, or also called King Xerxes, is in all three books. Remember, he's the king that Esther is married to in the book of Esther. Esther has a different author, though. So all three of these books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, basically happen at the same time in history and in the same areas. Ezra and Nehemiah happen in Judah, the Promised Land. Esther happens back in the exile area of Babylon, Susa, where all the exiles came from. So when you read any of these books, you want to keep that in mind. So let's set some basic timelines for the events of the book to establish some context for the content of the books. So the exile is a 70-year exile, remember, but it didn't all happen at once. It wasn't like they all left at the same time. The exile had been going on for quite some time when in 587 BC, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed completely by the Babylonians, and everyone after that is out of Jerusalem. Then in 537 BC, after the Persians had defeated the Babylonians, the Persian ruler Cyrus decrees that the exiles may return to Judah. So it's the end of the 70 years. So that was in 538 BC. A year later, in 537 BC, the altar by the returning exiles is rebuilt. Then in 516 BC, so we're talking some years later, some 20 years later, the second temple was completed. So it took them quite a lot of time to build it. And then in 458 BC, Ezra arrives in Jerusalem. So most of the history that's told in Ezra happens long before Ezra actually shows up. Now, when we say the exiles returned, it was only about 42 to 43,000 that actually returned. The vast majority of them remained in Persia or Babylon. Some would come later, some would never come. So Ezra tells the story and also participates in the story of the temple being rebuilt, and I guess you could say maybe it's temple service being started. So Ezra arrives in 458 BC. Nehemiah arrives 13 years later in 445 BC, and he's there to lead the rebuilding of the walls around the city of Jerusalem. So Ezra is a big factor in getting the temple rebuilt, and Nehemiah is a big factor in getting the walls around the city which contain the temple rebuilt. Just a little more context. The events of Esther occur between 486 and 465 BC, so after the second temple's been rebuilt, but before Ezra and Nehemiah go there. And remember, the events of Esther occur in Persia and Susa and not in the Promised Land, but they're happening all at the same time. So the book of Ezra starts off with Cyrus's proclamation that the Jews can start returning to Judah. This is highly unusual because Cyrus, is a pagan king who knows nothing about the one true God. But God talks to him somehow and tells him to send the Jews back, and he obeys. Now, there's no indication that Cyrus became a true believer that gave up all his other gods. He just didn't want to make mad the one that was talking to him. The result of this proclamation is that, roughly 43,000 do return, although they need some urging and some over 500,000 don't return. We have to remember that for over 70 years, many of them had made Babylon their home, and some of the younger generation had never lived in Judah. It was a foreign land to them, a strange land to them. So why move there? Yes, my ancestors came from there, but I don't remember anything about it. Ezra, much like in the book of Chronicles, has his lists of people, and he divides them by families and categories. He focuses on the priesthood and other temple servants. He lists the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and then the temple servants and the son of Solomon's servants. The first order of business is getting that altar rebuilt and the religious worship started again. Get the people back to worshiping God the way our people did 70 years ago is the thought. That was important because their God and their worship were central to their identity as a people. Who were they without the temple? So first they rebuild the altar and then they start rebuilding the temple. And this is no easy task because it requires a lot of labor and materials. Remember, this temple had been utterly burned to the ground. So it's going to take some time. There are people already in the land who have been living there before the exiles arrived. And they volunteer to help rebuild the temple. But the Jews say, no, this is our deal. And so those people began to oppose the building of the temple. Now, who are these people? Do you remember? After Israel, the northern tribe, had been taken into captivity by the Assyrians in 722 BC, there were people who moved into the land from Assyria, and they settled it. This is northern Israel. And there were also a number of people from Israel, Jews from the poorest and of the lowest classes, who were basically left behind, were not taken in exile. And these two groups intermarried and became the Samaritans. As the years went on and Judah went into exile, these Samaritans moved then into Judah as well. So that's who we're talking about. These were Samaritans. So now when Judah returned from the exile, these people were already there. And they'd formed their own religion, which combined the worship of the Jewish God and also pagan superstitions. And they were not happy to see Judah return and move into their territory. And so when they saw the temple being rebuilt, they reminded them, hey, we're related, and offered to help. But they were not doing it because they wanted to see Judah restored, but probably because they either wanted to undercut the efforts from the inside or have influence on how it was rebuilt and how the worship was conducted. So the leaders of Judah were right to tell them to take a hike. Unfortunately, it would also lead to hatred between the Jews and Samaritans clear up to the time 400 some years later with Jesus. Now, the people opposing the building write a letter to then King Artaxerxes saying, hey, these guys are troublemakers from Judah, and their building is temporarily halted because they don't know how to handle it, the leaders back in Babylon. But only for a little while. And then the Jews just on their own go back and start building anyway. In a desperate attempt to finally stop the whole rebuilding, Tataniah, who opposes the building, writes to King Darius questioning why all this building is going on in the first place and why are these people here? Darius makes a search of the records and finds that King Cyrus ordered it. And so he tells the Jews' enemies not only to let them rebuild it, but to help them pay for it. He says, give them all the resources that they need. So the temple gets built and is dedicated, and the first Passover in the homeland is celebrated. Now, this temple is a low-budget version of Solomon's temple. It looks nice, but not as nice as it used to, which causes some consternation among the older exiles who remember what the first one looked like. This is when Ezra shows up with a bunch more exiles. Then we read all about Ezra's background and genealogy, as well as the genealogies of all those who have returned. This reminds us again of Chronicles. One of the problems that is encountered, though, is there's not enough Levites to do all the work required in the new temple. So Ezra is instrumental in getting a bunch of them to come out of exile and return to Judah. Once everyone is settled in, Ezra discovers, to his great dismay, that many of the Jewish men had married pagan wives, and this was causing many of the Jews to be led astray. And so he demands that they divorce these wives and send them on their way. The people repent of their intermarriages and do just that. Now, they no doubt make sure the pagan wives are taken care of, but the marriages are dissolved. Now, the reason that these intermarriages were sinful was not because of race or culture or language, but because of faith. The pagans were not believers in the one true God, and it was forbidden to marry someone of another faith. If these pagans had converted, it would not have been a problem. The mandate, by the way, still applies today. The New Testament forbids Christians to marry non-Christians. Now, we don't dissolve marriages where believers have married unbelievers, but we do encourage and hope that the unbeliever will eventually become a believer. This takes us to Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, and he hears about how the temple was finished, but the walls around Jerusalem, which protect the city and the temple, are not being rebuilt, and how everything is going really bad. He appeals to the king to be allowed to go and lead the rebuilding of the walls, and the king sends him. Nehemiah walks into a contentious situation because there are so many non-Jews in the land who oppose this wall being built, just like they oppose the temple, because they are afraid that it will allow Judah to grow strong and that they will end up being driven from the land by these people from Judah. It's so bad that when Nehemiah arrives, he has to inspect the walls at night so as not to be seen. He is amazed how bad it is and organizes work crews to start rebuilding. Here we run into some more lists. It's like the guy can't help himself. He has to tell us who's in charge of each section and each individual man who's doing it. Sanballat and Tobiah, who are of these pagans, oppose the work and threaten the Jews to the point that they have to place guards while they work. And the workers work with one hand, holding a sword in another. This was a horrible, not easy task. In the midst of this, Nehemiah gets complaints from the poor Jews that the wealthier ones are oppressing them. Nehemiah steps in and demands they stop charging their fellow Jews interest on loans. Charging interest was actually against Jewish Old Testament laws, but they were doing it anyway. He tells them, instead of oppressing the poor, help them out. Nehemiah leads by example by doing this. Unable to intimidate the workers, Sanballat and Tobiah turn to Nehemiah and try to kill him off. They keep inviting him for meetings, but he knows they have the full intention of just killing him, so he always refuses to show up. Finally, the walls are completed. Nehemiah goes back to doing his lists again of all the inhabitants and of all the things that contributed to the rebuilding of the temple and the walls, and the people begin to celebrate the Jewish festivals, and Nehemiah has the law read to all the people. This reminds us of what Josiah did after his servants found the book of the law in the temple. It all ends with the people confessing their sins to God and asking for forgiveness, which he gives to them. Well, that ends it for us this week, but we still have some territory to cover next week in the book of Nehemiah, and then we will be going right into Esther next week, which is one of the greatest stories in the Old Testament, and then we'll start to venture into the book of Job, the great book about suffering. So thank you for joining us for The Road to Jesus with Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana, and we will see you next week. Peace out.